warning, graphic content, political cartoons, comics, and the uncensored artistic mind. This is going to be a series of talks I'll be doing over the next few weeks about the history of art as commentary, and this will be the first installment. We will also be expanding our understanding of what commentary is, I suppose, since commentary is typically associated with argument and opinion, but sometimes there are just mere statements of facts and visual proofs that act as their own commentary. Quite often when it comes to trying to decipher the meaning of political events or cultural events, best to see visual proof of it. What does injustice look like? What does devastation look like? These are things that are typically masked by argument and opinion. So we are going to be looking at how those things are revealed outside of the lingual form. So let's just begin with a very basic question. And the question is, how do we read the world? Now, when it comes to reading the world, there's 1,000 different ways that you can break this kind of question down, but just for the sake of argument and how we should proceed at the beginning of this talk is we'll just keep it very simple. And we'll break it down by saying that we read the world with our heart and our mind. Now, when it comes to the heart and the mind, obviously, we have the heart, which is typically considered the emotional center, which is the non-lingual apparatus with which we use to take in information about the world. And then there is the mind, which is the lingual form. Basically, it is the words and concepts that we use to label the real world with. What does that mean? Let's look at it this way. Words represent how we communicate with reality, while images represent how reality communicates with us. So we're going to break these two forms of communication down into a language, and we will label them conceptual language and the experiential language. One is learned, and one is already intrinsic to us. We already know it. The intellect is basically built out of learned information, and the experiential is what we already know through our physiologies. Let me give you an example of exactly what I'm talking about. Right now, you're looking at the word cold. You can read the word cold because I assume that most of you understand the English language. Now, if this was written in Swahili or something and you did not understand, if you weren't Rwandan or something and didn't understand the Swahili language, you would not know what I was talking about. You would just see a simple symbol. So you read this, it enters into your intellectual facility, and then you can do whatever you want with that concept. Am I talking about the Cold War? Am I talking about cold weather? Am I talking about the emotional unavailability of somebody? Now, the artistic language, what we're calling the experiential language, would look like this. Now, this as a form of language should hit you with a greater emphasis on immediacy. You see something like this, and your physiology reads it instantaneously as cold. After that, you can then move it into your brain, and then you can start asking questions about who painted this? Where is this from? And once you do that, you remove yourself from the reality that this is communicating into the concept of reality. And then you try to make sense out of it. Now, as you can see, this is the word shit. Now you can anticipate how the experiential language would render this word in a physical way, which would be this. While putting this lecture together, it was an editorial decision not to show you an actual picture of shit because I am not a monster. Although I would be curious to find out if you had a moment of anticipatory anxiety at the idea that I would be showing you an actual picture of shit. And then we move on to love. Conceptually, we know what it is. How does it apply to each and every one of us? Art can extrapolate that out in a trillion different directions and reveal the messiness of life. Same thing with success. What does success look like? It looks like many different things. What is the flip side of success? For somebody to have success, typically there has to be failure. Now, what would that look like? It potentially would look like all of these. You have 9/11, you have Jeff Bezos and Amazon, you've got the atom bomb, and then you've got the Holocaust. All of these from the perspective of those who perpetrated what is happening here some who continue to perpetrate what is being represented here. That is their version of success. Same complication with something like civilization. So this is civilization. This is the conquering of the West by the invading Europeans. And it was perpetuated as divinely inspired. There's a lot of images that we'll be seeing that capitalize on Kipling's notion of the white man's burden, which unfortunately is something that continues today. So this is a depiction of civilization from a certain perspective. And again, the flip side of that would be this, the conquering of the West and the destruction of the populations that pre-existed the European colonization of the region. What you see in the upper left, it's the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And it's the forced assimilation of Native Americans. The founder was Richard Henry Pratt, and the motto of the school was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Peace. What does peace look like? This could be very simply demonstrated by something like this. As you can see here, this is Netanyahu standing on a giant pile of Palestinian skulls. Peace has been achieved because there is nothing left to challenge the slaughter. That is a version of peace. And here you have the president/king is not a nice guy. Now, this has been a subject in art for a very, very long time. And not just art, I mean, from radically humane politics for a very long time. And artists tend to fall into that category for obvious reasons that I will expound upon later on. But when we have the president/king is not a nice guy, that is a concept. Now, what would that look like? Now, what you're looking at here is a cartoon called Gargantua from Honoré Daumier, who's considered the grandfather of all political cartooning. And what's interesting about this particular piece is, as you can see, you have the king here depicted as a gargantuan, disgusting, pear-shaped monster who the poor and the common citizen is forced to hand over basically all of their worldly goods to the king, and the king ingests them and then shits out all of these writs and privileges for his supporters. As you can see, they are gathering them and maintaining in the upper echelon of elite society, while the commoner is left in rags and sorrow. So most significant about this piece is that it was published in 1831, and Daumier was sent to prison for creating it. Actually, he was sent to prison for 2 months, and then he spent 4 months in an asylum. At any rate, the pattern previous to Daumier being arrested and thrown into jail was that they would do that with the editor/publisher, or they would do that with the printmaker. The idea being that artists are unreliable when it comes to civilized behavior quite often. They will take chances. They will do all of these things. And then it is up to the editor to look at it and just be like, are you out of your fucking mind? No, we will not publish this. Now, if it slipped past the editor and publisher who said, let's take a chance, then the final the gatekeeper would be the printmaker. This is also a version of the president/king is not a nice guy. And then we go to war. Now, when it comes to war, in the past, the artists typically rendered these scenes as being highly choreographed and very staged, almost like sporting events. I mean, just look at this. There's not a great deal of intimacy. It's like a sporting event. So you can see by every single one of these that it would be easy to utilize this kind of art to perpetuate notions of bravery and patriotism and all of those things, and even inevitability when it came to conflicts between nations, because they are somewhat palatable because of the distance from what is actually going on. And then you run into the work of somebody like Francisco Goya. Now, Goya did a series of etchings in 1810 to 1820 that were called the Disasters of War series. what's unique about these is that they were not published while he was alive. He actually thought something was wrong with him because of his impulse to want to capture what he saw in Spain during the Peninsular Wars when Napoleon was ravaging the country. And what Napoleon would do, what the army would do, is they would defeat Spanish soldiers and they would humiliate them in this way. What you're looking at here, they would behead them, they would cut their genitals off, and they would hang them up for people to see. They would disembowel them. They would do all sorts of wretched things. The idea being that don't fuck with Napoleon. This was a tactic, and one that worked quite well to discourage people from wanting to enlist and fight in a war. Here's a couple more from that series. So what's especially important about something like this is that an artist's impulse to want to capture life as it really is something that is unique to communication. Usually when it comes to how we catalog our lives or the time that we live in, is that we try to connect it to what the dominant culture says is appropriate. Okay, so this was considered so obscene, would have been considered so obscene in the early 1800s, that Goya's impulse was just like, I can't be seen as a pervert, even though this is something that is happening. You know, what is it inside of me that wants to depict these things that are so horrible? And of course, the impulse is to capture the truth and talk about the truth and not allow it to be so veiled in bullshit. It's the same thing that happened to Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote a piece called The War Prayer. And similarly to what Goya's feelings were about his depiction, Twain did not allow The War Prayer to be published while he was alive. He told a friend that he had told the whole truth, and the whole truth is not acceptable to civilized society. So this can be published after I'm dead. And in The War Prayer, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's really, really wonderful. It's really great because it has a madman enter a church where the congregation is being very excited about their sons and husbands going off to fight in a war the next day. And they're praying for them. And then this mysterious stranger comes in and says he's a spokesperson for God and helps lead the prayer. And so what he talks about is the wretchedness and the brutality of what they're actually excited about. So that brings us to the artist. Who is an artist? What is an artist? And what makes an artist unique? Now, what you're looking at here is a self-portrait by Daumier. And it's Daumier sitting in his studio looking at what one might assume is a blank canvas. It's a wonderful depiction of what that feels like to an artist, and also the reality of anybody. You don't even have to be an artist. Anybody who is attempting to get to the bottom of something will seek isolation, because when you're in a private space, it's easier to concentrate and to not be swayed by bullshit, social conventions, various other things that do not allow the free wandering of the mind in search of substantive, meaningful facts that can be assembled as some sort of viable truth rather than public opinion, say. An analogy that I quite often give to people when it comes to this part of the discussion about what an artist is, I usually pose just a very simple question. And the question is, if you are sitting alone at home, nobody else is around, and you get an itchy ass, what do you do? And of course, the answer is you scratch your ass. There's never a moment's pause where you say, let me see if I can get rid of this irritant by just simply ignoring it, pretending it is not there. You do not do that. You scratch your ass immediately. Now, if you just consider that a metaphor for somebody who is experiencing an irritant and then wants to alleviate the irritation, extend that into other non-corporeal irritants. Say, for instance, the idea that Black people are inferior to white people, that women are the lesser sex, that gay people are some sort of deviance inside of a society that should not accept them. Now, those are irritants, and they are irritants that can only exist and be perpetuated outside of private spaces. Anybody who sits in a private space, just like you would scratch your own ass, presented with bullshit ideas that attempt to reinforce inequality and certain prejudices. Prejudices only exist when they are not tested over and over again in everyday life. Anybody with a mother, aunt, sister, daughter knows in their hearts absolutely 100% that the women are not the inferior sex by any stretch. But take that out into the public sphere, and all of a sudden, it's something else. You self-censor, you embrace bullshit, and you ignore what is obvious. You can do it with dirty words, in fact. Dirty words are only considered obscene when you say them in a public space. Try to offend yourself by saying over and over again in your head the dirtiest words that you can think of. Or if you're sitting at home alone, just try to say them, and you will see that they are completely defanged of toxicity. Their obscenity only comes from other people outside who, inside of polite society, have been coerced by rote repetition and rehearsal, nothing else, to think that they are dangerous. And thus we come to the cartoon, which often uses imagery in its attempt to demand a reconsideration of political ideas and cultural ideologies to better understand their viability and our connection to them. Now, the original definition of the cartoon was that it was the preliminary sketch for a larger piece of art. And when you're doing preliminary sketches for anything, just like when you're doing first drafts when you're writing, or you're noodling around on the guitar when you're trying to figure out the melody to which you're going to build a song, what you're doing is you're taking chances. You're reconsidering a lot of things to figure out how the sinew or the building blocks are going to fit together in a way that are meaningful to you, or that resonate in some way. And when you're doing that, you are fully turned on to possibilities. Right? It's a really wonderful metaphor for how one might want to approach life, with a certain openness and fearlessness and real desire for adventurism. So, put another way, the purpose of a cartoon was never to embody perfection, but rather to use imperfection to communicate possibility. This is a Rodin, quote unquote, cartoon of one of his sculptures, The Embrace. I tend to love Rodin's sketches. I sometimes prefer them to his actual finished sculptures because they are so lyrically rendered and so mindlessly present. When you do work for yourself and you're not worried about judgment from other people, because the assumption is they're not going to see it, you are so free and you are so fearless and you are connected to life and not social convention. And what comes out of that quite often is very, very moving and powerful. This is Cafe Terrace at Night. This is one of the preliminary sketches that Van Gogh would do. And the wonderful thing about Van Gogh is he really stayed true to his preliminary sketches. There's the finished piece. And here's just a couple pages of Robert Crumb, famed underground cartoonist. I call him the Picasso of the underground comics movement. We'll definitely be looking at his stuff. But this is one of his many, many, many sketchbooks where he's just rendering faces and gesture and ideas that are just interesting to him. Now, while these portraits done by an artist whose name is Guy Denning, they are not preliminary sketches for finished pieces of art. They are pieces of art that were rendered in the moment very quickly on material that was not going to last very long. It's what he could find during the Occupy Wall Street movement. As you can see, it's newspapers, it's cardboard, it's things like that. And what's wonderful about it is that not only does it capture the immediacy of the movement, but it also captures the vulnerability of it. These are not rendered in marble. These are not thrown onto canvases that are going to be commodified later and then sold and so forth. This is capturing a human moment, the emotions of the time on material that reflects the tenuousness of protest and people calling out for help. people congregating around their mutual pain in an attempt to ameliorate suffering. Now, this is a wonderful example of the experiential language. Now, what you're looking at here is Jackson Pollock's most famous painting, arguably, and it's called Autumn Rhythm Number 30. And what I love about that is I love how many of Pollock's paintings and many of the abstract expressionists, when they painted, they labeled and titled their pieces of art with often just numbers, and quite often just simply called them untitled. The idea being that you cannot label something as dynamic as what these canvases are attempting to communicate. It's trying to pull a experience, put it in a bottle, label the bottle, and say, I've captured the meaning, when you haven't captured anything. You've reframed it and abstracted it into something less than its actuality. And this is one of my absolute favorite Pollocks, and it serves much of what we've talked about so far. What you're seeing here is this piece is called Portrait and a Dream, and it was done in 1953. And I love it because the portrait on the left, you can see, is non-literal. If you look close, you can sort of start to see, I guess, that there is a figure in there somehow, somewhere. In fact, I think I can maybe even see two. But you can see that it is a complication. It's all over the place. It's unnameable in any legitimate way, which is what life looks like. Now, if you look to the right and you see the dream component of this piece, you see that the dream does have edges, does have some clarity to it, but it is not real. The portrait is real. The dream is the concoction. And what Pollock is saying with something like this, from my perspective, is that once we start to decipher reality and then we start to codify it and turn it into something that is recognizable, then it only becomes about itself and becomes less about life. Now, finally, just to put a cap on this idea that there is something that is markedly different between the conceptual experience and the experiential experience, is something like this. Now, this is the Grand Canyon at sunset. Anybody who has stood in front of something as moving as this knows that the one thing that you could do to completely fuck it up is to try to talk about it. Particularly if you're with somebody. Say you're with somebody standing at the lip of the Grand Canyon, and this is what you're looking at. And if you turn to the person next to you and you started to yammer on and on about what you're looking at, did you know that the very first person to come upon the Grand Canyon thought it was blah, 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 blah? Do you know how the pink is created in the sky? It's the atmosphere that... It would take you out of the moment. It would ruin the experience for the person next to you who might have the impulse to hurl you into the canyon. So it's the one thing that you don't do. You want to be speechless. You want to be silent. That's when you commune with the here and now, and that is the significance of the moment. That is the free flow of reality that is unmitigated by the cheapness of the abstractions that you would start hurling with language to explain, to intellectualize what you're looking at. And this is something that the abstract expressionists knew about. So, for example, look at this and then just compare this to a Mark Rothko. Now, Mark Rothko's idea, very similar to what you would experience standing and looking at the Grand Canyon at sunset, is that he created canvases that were pretty sizable. The idea being that you would step up to it and the size would allow it to leak into as much of your peripheral vision as possible. You would start hurling words at the canvas that you're looking at, and it would be completely unsatisfying to do such a thing. And it would also not reveal anything to you, very similar to if you were doing it standing in front of the Grand Canyon. So what would be left is, once you burn off the intellectualizing of what you're looking at and trying to make literal your experience, what's left is the surrender to the physiological connection that is all of a sudden made to real life and to the real world. Again, this has a lot to do with understanding that words do not reveal anything about life. They create a narrative that you are comfortable letting stand in as a faux reality, because you can then see the parameters of it. You can hold it in your mind. And once you can hold something in your mind, you can assume a certain amount of ownership over it. You can pretend that you comprehend its purpose because you have created its legitimacy by making it a symbol of reality, rather than having to be blown away and made insignificant by something that transcends your comprehension. So the last thing I want to talk about is the gullibility of human consciousness. People tend to have this idea that because they have this consciousness that utilizes sight and sound and smell, that what they're doing is they're actually interacting with reality. Now, there are a couple demonstrations that I can show to you that will demonstrate this as being foolhardy, this idea that human consciousness is a clear window, ungraffitied by anything, that we perceive some consistent reality through. Consider this, for example. When you look at it, your consciousness is trying to grapple with the physicality of this and apply it to the physics that you understand when you're just existing in the world. Once your brain settles into a section of the picture that it recognizes being a viable reality, it is forced to shift in a new different way once your eyes track to another part of the picture. And you can feel the strain of your brain trying to constantly square what it's looking at with the reality that it thinks it knows. Similarly here, all of the lines that are running as diagonals are parallel to each other. And yet your brain and your consciousness makes it impossible to see the reality of what is exactly in front of you. It is forever altering it in a way and preventing your eyes from seeing what is exactly in front of it. This is not an animated image. The ball is not slowly rolling. It is an illusion that your consciousness is creating in the moment. When we look at art, we're looking at the artifact that was created utilizing just a small handful of tools. And what are these tools? Well, art is usually just simply the artifact that comes from the manipulation of pencils, brushes, paint, and canvas or paper. Now, to exemplify once again how gullible human consciousness is, understand that once those elements come together to create an image for our consideration, we will always see the intention of the artist above the reality of the components that conspire to create that image. This, for example, you can see what the intention of the artist was. You can never look at this and merely say, I am looking at pencil on paper, when in fact, that is all that it is. You cannot see the reality. You can only react to the illusion that was created by the artist. You cannot simply look at this and say, I am only seeing paint applied to a canvas with a brush. Now, allow this demonstration to also make sense to how we use the words in the language of our politics, our culture, and our religion to equally confound us with an inability to directly interface with truth. It is similarly the curation of words and concepts that conspire to create the reality we think we inhabit, as opposed to the one that we actually do. Thusly, I give you Ambrose Bierce's definition of art, which is a noun. This word has no definition. And if you don't know Ambrose Bierce and you don't know his most famous book, The Devil's Dictionary, I urge you to get it. Bierce was a contemporary of Mark Twain and utilized satire brilliantly to let it be known to us that the world is as malleable as any clay, incapable and indifferent to the charade of shaping itself, as any cloud seeking our approval for being a duck, a rabbit, or a turtle. So why use art when trying to figure out the parameters of truth and beauty and purpose? We will find out. Thanks for listening.